just basic rules for this debate. We shall observe and respect all speakers. That is to say, pure eyes by default through the chat space unless the speaker specifies otherwise. If they ask you to put the PI in the chat space, please do respect that. And also please do respect the cultures of different speakers and their identities as well. Do not at any point disrespect like their identities. Also, like respect the speakers based on their preferred pronouns. Everyone has already like said how they prefer to be addressed in the debate. I think like that's one of the best things that we can do, just to respect like the speakers as a whole. Anyways, without further ado, I invite the Prime Minister. Here. Opening government. Yes, you are. Yes, you are. When you are ready. PM, if you're speaking, can't hear you anymore. I was hearing you, but I can't hear you anymore. Raima. Okay.
What do we mean by multiculturalism in this debate today? Multiculturalism is the cultures or races, let me say ethnicities, particularly those of minority groups. This is a special acknowledgement of their.
We didn't hear anything from the start, so if you can start afresh, like from like the way go, yeah.
Pardon?
Hear anything from the start, so if you can start afresh. Like restart your speech altogether.
I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Let me just reset my timer. Okay, I'm going to begin this speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. The main purpose of multiculturalism is that it creates a space for different cultures to coexist with each other. And panel, in a world where we see many cases of marginalization, discrimination, and disruptions against people, we see it only justified to carry out this policy. The fact that according to status quo, we see many problems striking the human race and all that. And as us, the human race, also have an active obligation to stand with each other and acknowledge our differences. We actually see it very justified to carry out this policy. Now, first of all, how are we going to define multiculturalism in this debate? First of all, the cultures, races, ethnicities, particularly those of minority groups, is that special acknowledgement of their differences within a dominant political culture. Now, by this policy, we are basically mean, like, let me say the Kurdistan, like, let me say in Turkey, like, we are calling out, like, let me say that Turkish, like, let me say government to actually pass out, like, a policy of, like, let me say, their them in class, like let me about their culture and like acknowledging their cultures, something like that. Now, moving on to the second thing. Now, what are nationalistic identities? Now, by nationalistic identities, basically mean a person's identity or sense of belonging to one or more nations. So, which questions are we going to handle in this debate today? First, we're going to handle why promoting this. Secondly, we're going to handle what are the impacts of all? Then our second speaker is going to come and what even at the expense of nationalistic stakeholder to handle. Why are we promoting? Now, first of all, it promotes equality. Now, we don't mean like, okay, we acknowledge the fact that equality can't really be solved in society, like we can't all be equal at the same place. Then we are actually going to narrow down the gap of equality. Now, by doing this, acknowledging their nationalistic views, let me say their culture views, like carrying out multiculturalism, we actually think these people are actually going to be equalized in society, because how is this actually going say like allow their cultural practices to be carried out and all that. Like we're going to see like a narrow down in the gap of like let me say equality. Yeah, we're going to see like these people like actually feel the sense that they're, let me say, in Kurdistan currently, they aren't allowed to like let me say practice their cultural views, they aren't allowed to speak their language and all that. It's actually not acknowledged. So by doing this, it's actually by doing this in different countries, it's actually going to promote equality in those countries. Even if it's not going to promote that substantive equality on the same level, it's going to promote a state of equality and also like narrow down the gap. Now, moving on to the second thing, which is it's going to promote. Now, we've seen in many instances, like in the vast majority of instances, we have seen in different countries, like let me say Afghanistan, we have seen that it is actually currently at war because like they're at war, they're actually lacking peace. We're seeing the largest humanitarian crisis going this. Now, when this is actually it's going to peace, why? Because the first of all, when we look into like let me say documents and all that, we see that the main reason why actually these countries are actually fighting, these minorities are fighting because they don't have what their identities aren't promoted. Like there is no multiculturalism. They're actually forced to follow, like, let me say, one. Reasons. So it's actually going to be beneficial to the government. It's actually going to promote peace in those different countries because these governments have actually set out a good image for these people. Now, moving on to my fifth point, this is actually the pluralist view. Now, this pluralist view is actually based on also like protection of minority groups. Like, let me give you an example of the Kurds and the fact that Kurdistans be marginalized in their societies. They aren't allowed to like carry out like let me say multiculturalism and like do their different things like that. In society, there are let me say cultures aren't allowed to be celebrated and all that. So like when the government carry out this out, we actually see it actually we actually see like it's carrying out its incentive, which is like let me say the pluralist. Now, how is it actually going to benefit society? Because like the government are actually going to set out a good picture for society. Then after carrying this out, the government are going to actually it's going to be better for peace in the countries now. Secondly, my second thing, which is actually what are the impacts of violence now? When we carry this out, we see as opposed to the world that we currently living with, let me say discrimination, like lack of cultural diversity. When we carry out, we think this world a world of in the event like you teach like different cultures, okay, different people to like learn, okay, to like other cultures and all that, and you diversify the cultures. We're seeing a world like let me say with coexistence. Like for example, the Turkish are going to actually coexist with the Kurds. It's actually going to be a better picture. Now, moving on to the second thing, a world with more civilization. Said before, it's actually going to carry out, like, let me say, less marginalization. We're going to have less marginalization. We're going to have more peace because the fact that we see in the vast majority of instances, most people actually fighting in, like, let me say, the actually basically because their cultures aren't actually acknowledged in society, and like they aren't really like let me say taken into society. So as opposed to a world without like let me say this multiculturalism, our world is actually better because it's going to be the world with peace, a world with coexistence, a world with less marginalization, a world where in society feel equal to each other. However, it's not going to be that safe quality. It's going to actually be a better world to live in. That's why we aside opening actually take this in account. What this house believes that states should culturalism even at the expense of the nationalistic identities. That's my case by saying that opening government has won this debate today. Thank you very much.
Very much primed for the speech. And case of opening opposition here. Zuzera, can you hear us? Zuzera, can you hear us?
Can you guys hear me?
I can hear you. So if you can't hear me, how do you respond?
Can everyone hear me? Can everyone hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
If you can hear me, that means everyone can hear me.
Definitely. If they can't hear you, they'll just put in the chat space. But yeah.
When can I begin to present? Okay, thank you so much. My name is Zuzeka Ndavela from the opposition team. I believe that promoting multiculturalism at the expense of the national identities is not going to create peace, is not going to create unity, as the proposition member has declared. We believe that even though we can have peace and unity in the country, realistically speaking, there is no such thing as there's something that will not happen. That's not something that can be attained or be reached at a specific short time. It will take time. It will take years. Individuals will not adapt to that. A perfect example is that South Africa is a diverse country, but the tribes live in a unique way and pursue cultures in a different way. And if the state promotes multiculturalism, we think that is going to obstruct other people, is going to undermine other people's culture, because people have different ways, have different cultures, and they celebrate their cultures in a different way. And I believe that we should promote it. Culture is as a way of connecting with our ancestors and connecting our ancestors that gives us power and unity. And it promotes us as different as we are. It makes us like being it brings the soul it brings like the what's the name the identity. So in I think it will not work, because language as a barrier is a very big problem of multiculturalism. People may fear to lose their identity with multiculturalism. I think it will create tensions between different cultures and different backgrounds. Because as a country, we live in a state has cultures and different people who are proud of who they are and do not want to change their background, do not want to change their cultures, do not want to adopt other people's cultures. Hello, everyone.
Proceed.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much. I think promoting multiculturalism in a country will like local be towards this concept, because the view that and ethnic particularities of the differences within the Dominion culture is a very important issue. It's something that is personal, because our cultures It's something that we inherited from our grandparents, something that connects us to our ancestors, and it's important in that way. Let's look at the issue of the Palestinians, the Israelis and Tibalians. Those countries have been fighting for over a decade. If they were for a decade now, if there was such a positive outcome about multiculturalism, the House would have seen it in those two countries. It created many feelings, like tensions between the two states. So my point is that multiculturalism only promotes tension between people, and we've seen, like, if you follow the news, you see that in the charts that I just mentioned. Also, it is an issue between in the language barrier, because we as individuals, for example, in South Africa, we have 9 languages, and we are proud to embrace our languages, are proud to stand out, to be a part to as who we are. We, like the issue of adopting to a certain thing, it's a problem, because it now undermines our identity. It undermines the true of our true selves. It undermines our true self, and also people may fear to lose their identity in a sense that they are now adopting to that is being pursued by the state, of which that's just totally unfair in my side. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dean of Opposition, for that great speech. I invite the DP to proceed the case of the government bench here. DPM. Please. Operating government, she got wasting my time.
Can you please call out his or her name? Maybe that would be helpful.
Oh, it's Tracy.
I'm sorry, am I audible now?
Yeah,
am I audible now? Okay. POIs after the 4th minute. Before I promise I'm not taking them. In fact, don't ask me for POIs, I'll ask you for the POIs myself. I'll start my speech in 3. Panel, according to what we have just heard, it seems the leader of opposition has mistaken what multiculturalism is. So allow me to first repeat the definition before I took and then a stakeholder analysis and why we are doing this even at the expense of the nationalistic identities. So now, multiculturalism is the view that suggests cultures, races, and ethnicities are better to be accepted. That means they deserve some sort of special treatment and acknowledgement. So, Pana, before I go into my case, allow me to do a bit of rebuttal. So she comes and says that it will not happen and it cannot be adapted. Pana, allow me to show you how this is true. First of all, we are creating policies through that state, right? That is to say, if a state creates a policy, for example, if people who are not vaccinated are not going to school, Pana, we feel that either way, even if people don't want, they are going to follow these policies, right? So the fact that the state is actually in charge of this, and even if people they'll be forced to follow it. Why? Because it's government policy. To the second thing she said, the state is going to obstruct other people different cultures, something. Why? Because people have different cultures and they are not able to accept each other. We find people fighting. For example, the Shona fighting with Ndebele, or the Baganda fighting with the Bagitu. Why? Because they have different cultures that cannot be accepted, right? So we feel that in the event that multiculturalism is put into place, we feel that at least it can create, it can them, so we have a society where people can actually live with each other. And that is an advantage we have to their side. And she gives things like language barrier, something of that sort. And we feel that you see the fact that this house believes emotion. And we are not going to try to come and debate feasibility. We feel like she's out on this point. And she says she wants to embrace their culture, something of that sort. And we live in a society like that PM came and told you, and for example, the Kurds, right? They do not have a say, they cannot embrace their culture. Why? Because multiculturalism is not there. And we feel like if we embrace multiculturalism, and we are able to support the minority as people. And she says it's going to only promote tension between people. And we feel that that is not going to happen. Why? Because actually this policy is not actively put into place. There is a lot of tension. People do not accept each other's cultures. We have a lot of people fighting. There is not some sort of peace, right? But if to place policies, for example, policies including those, then probably the government can actually go ahead and probably, talk to these people, create some sort of sensitization. The government takes upon itself and tries to help this multiculturalism, and we feel that it's going to reduce. We're trying to create different cultures of people. And moving on to my case, right? And why are we doing this even at the expense? Why are we doing this even at the expense of the nationalistic entities, right? And we feel that if government put up policies, we feel like in the current status quo we live in, we feel that there's, for example, when we go to like tribes, right, there are going to be some sort of dominant tribes and minority tribes. And we feel that in the event that government put up policies, for example, if government tells everyone to vaccinate them, the fact that these people feel marginalized, or these people feel that they're not part of society. Why? Because their cultures are not embraced. We feel like it's hard for such people. This government doesn't care, they will not actually give them an incentive to actually follow a government policy, a government that actually, a state that actually doesn't protect them, right? Before I go into the second point, POI. What we're saying, right? On to the second point, panel, we feel that if we actually embrace this, it's going to be much easier for such people to actually follow these policies. Why? Because they feel like government is the PM speech of how the government has an incentive to protect all its citizens, whether the majority, in fact, government were mainly put into place in protect the minority. We feel it's going to be an issue. The first for in which people are actually trying to coexist with each other, right? And then what do we see the effect of this? First, we see that if this is the case, we're going to see it. In fact, the fact that this is going to be a slightly peaceful society, we feel like the state can attract investors to come and trade in this country. We see more trade. We feel like even when this, we feel like if this happens, the state can have more investors. Henceforth, the economy. To the second point, we feel that this because we bring policies that protect them, we feel that since the tribes are now in position to do things for the state, they can actually employ because of stereotyping. And how is this benefit to the main stakeholders in this, which are the minorities, right? We feel that the fact that multiculturalism is actually going to embrace, it's going to greatly affect the minorities of tribes. That is to say, people like the Kurds, right? We feel that if multiculturalism was actually embraced in the Kurds, whereby Kurds are actually accepted into society, whereby they are around probably take care of the elections, we feel that these people would not have suffered greatly as they have. We feel that they would not just be randomly killed, don't even considered people in society, right? Right? What opposition needs to prove to us in this debate that if multiculturalism is actually not actively put every stakeholder in this case, if if you vote for us, you vote for a side that caters for the minorities of people. Why are they important, we feel that they're important in this debate because they can actually the fact that they're in the state, it is the state's mandatory to actually.
Thank you very much, for that speech. I'll invite the deputy leader of opposition. I'm not so sure if Suzera in person, if you can give the second speech, because I don't see your partner in here. Suzera. Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you so much for the floor. Multiculturalism describes the existence as of multicultural conditions within a single jurisdiction, usually considered in terms of culture associated and ethnic group. I believe, okay, the opposition panel stated a very important point about COVID-19 is something that the state put a law that everyone should vaccinate. What if people do not want to vaccinate? What must happen? Undermines the opinions of other people, how people think and how people want to live their life. What about the right to live? What about the freedom of speech, the right to do what the minorities have, like, no need. How should they live, or how should they promote their culture? Looking at the Afghanistan issue just described, and the Taliban's issue, the peace that you were talking about. I cannot take your point, Pino. Thank you so much. Hello, everyone hear me? Multiculturalism is a state of being that boxed into a specific idea of which people have different ideas. People have different ways of living their life, of embracing who they are. I don't think government should intervene in how we should live our life, on our cultural policies. That is the societal, not the government, like the governmental issue, like not the political issue. Government need to put laws in everything that happens in the society. How many laws have government put in place and they actually worked? I believe that they are to they are so placing laws or creating laws or actively pursuing multiculturalism at the expense of national identities, I think it's something that will never take place. It's something that will not do good to citizens. Will not do good in everyone, because it identity, like, it boils them into a certain kind of idea of which that is the room for eliminate a room for people. Government plays the laws. Thank you so much.
Of course, in government. Yeah. We can hear you.
I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Panel. Opening opposition loses this debate when they claim that government has no incentive or obligation to engage the vulnerable in society because they've systematically failed. Two things. One, we think even at the point at which governments are bound to fail, we think because most of these minorities exist in extremely toxic structures that don't allow them to function and they've got no social institutions that they can opt to without being discriminated. We think even at the point at which these governments are going to fail like they've continuously done, we think that kind of intervention is justified and is necessary. But secondly, here's why governments don't fail at this point in time and why we think it's important that they inherently pursue these policies of multiculturalism. What do these policies actually look like? It can actually look like government establishing policies that criminalize this discrimination against most of these individuals that ascribe to other cultures and are systematically discriminated against. But secondly, we think it can actively look like government establishing social institutions that discriminated groups can opt into where they at the point which they denied like the ability to opt into other institutions that kind of things can actively look like establishing more schools, more churches, or education systems which most of these individuals that deny the ability to opt into can effectively buy into. I think at that point in time, government inherently pursues the entire aspect of acknowledging, but most importantly, embracing the existence of most of those cultures. The reason why this is important is because it engages opening options idea why we think when like force people to opt into the aspect of multiculturalism, what we do is we overshadow their others and people into this. We think this is not coercive in any way because governments puts in such a way that people can choose to opt in. But at the point of you criminalize this, it means that the individual has like a choice to be able to choose not to discriminate against point in time, government embraces that aspect of multiculturalism. But the reason why it's more important that this is at state level is that the vulnerable strike down upon society is because like these things started government level. Government like acknowledge, but most importantly, government legitimize the existence of more. At the point at which governments can effectively acknowledge the existence of these groups through the establishment of these policies, the establishment of these social institutions, we think we're in a better position to ripple this kind of change. Because when government does not acknowledge their existence, we think government directly affirms any kind of stereotype and any kind of discrimination that exists against those groups. We think this puts in government an incentive and obligation to establish these policies because they're in the best position to engage those rights. Today's debate, we think at the point at which like things like nationalistic identities are so important, the team that takes this debate is to show you why we think on our side of the world we've got more value for those nationalistic identities when we actually pursue the aspect of multiculturalism, but most importantly, the value of that nationalistic identity exists in its most meaningful form, which is the most important aspect of the debate, right? Firstly, to engage why we think like that entire value exists. I think cultural identity is important, but most importantly, we think it is more valuable and more meaningful when society has the choice to opt particular identity without being forced by different social institutions to opt into that. I think choice exists in its most meaningful form when individuals have got multiple options to choose. But most importantly, in an alternative, I think the latter world means like that kind of choice is meaningless and is coercive when individuals nearly exist in a world and constant overriding value of culture where they're then forced to opt into. I think there's more of an incentive for those individuals to uphold that particular culture, but most importantly, when the individuals opt into that culture willingly, they're in a better position to buy it. We think ideas of nationalism become toxic when like they exist in a space where that kind of nationalism is diluted. But most importantly, is like there's no like any other culture that individuals can choose to opt into. At the point in time, literally, we didn't value for the existence of other different cultures. It means we create echo chambers within our society. When do we create echo chambers? Two scenarios. One, when there's like an overriding value and overriding glorification of one culture. Like when like a specific culture is extremely isolated and is systematically delegitimized and its existence is not valid. At that point in time, it inherently means that the culture that is overglorified existing in an echo chamber. With number one, there's less chance of being accountable for anything that those individuals do because of the constant glorification, but most importantly, because of the constant value. But even on the cultures that are legitimized and in existence, in the existence is not valid, we think those are more likely to create their own. We cannot hold them accountable, but most importantly, in an attempt to spread their ideology and getting integration into mainstream society, they become more radical. This actually looks like cultures like the Boko Haram culture in North Africa. We think when like they don't get any kind of acknowledgement or any kind of integration in society, they become radical because they push their own echo chambers where they can spread their own ideology in the most radical way, but most that cannot hold them accountable. We think at the point at which governments promote multiculturalism, we've got no incentive to not only be able to not only allow these cultures to exist in society and be part of society in such a way that where we can hold them accountable, but most importantly, acknowledge their existence. But most importantly, there's no incentive for those individuals to be radical in an attempt to spread whatever kind of ideology they have. We think on the opposition side of the world, these individuals can create their own echo chambers. The problem with those echo chambers is that the minorities cannot hold like the majority populace accountable for anything. But most importantly, when the minority is practicing and expressing their ideology, we think they cannot be held accountable either. But the second argument is from like teacher that to say at the point at which you embrace like things like national multiculturalism, why is that important for like the state as the most important stakeholder in the debate? Two things. One, we think it means we give the state like a more liberty to the global village, and most importantly, we lift any kind of toxic ideologies of those being oppressive as being coercive. We think the point at which states that are inherently that are deemed as being oppressive, but most importantly, forcing their own ideology. Because states like North Korea, states like China, lift the entire aspect of being anti-progressive and on their individuals, moving in a better position to like give a better outlook and be more open to allies. At that point in time, most of the economies, as OG already gives you. We simply show why we think this is true when they inherently lift that veil of oppression from the social. But secondly, we think lack of cultural diversity paves way to a number of social evils. The inability to accept, acknowledge the existence of other social groups, like other social groups, that inherently means that even in like national level, it simply means that we don't acknowledge their existence. We exist in this echo chamber where we've got an overarching our culture is only things like, but most importantly, the government is only as an obligation towards us as like as a group, because we're only significant in the society. Why is things like xenophobic attacks systematically exist in most African countries? It's not because of the entire economic aspect, but because we view like most cultural races as races like we don't have an incentive and obligation towards, simply because of that cultural barrier, that cultural difference that exists. At the point at which government can inherently create social institutions in those spaces to embrace and acknowledge the existence of most of those individuals that are culturally diverse, when a better position can actually give individuals an incentive to have that kind of value for each other. I think there's more value for nationalistic values when and not coercing to forcing those also propose.
Thank you very much, member of government, for that great speech. I invite the member of opposition to open the case of present opposition here.
Panel, given our motion of multiculturalism, pursuing policies of multiculturalism at the expense, even at the expense of national identities, I would say that multiculturalism is important and it should be promoted, but it should not be promoted at the expense of nationalistic identities. I say that both the two, multiculturalism and nationalistic identities, should be promoted. In my extension, I would say that nationalistic identities should be promoted alongside multiculturalism because this will promote common goals and national superiority. This is why I will say that when promote nationalistic identities, for example, the national with the symbols which act as national emblems, such as the national flag, the coat of arms, and everything, this brings out togetherness and unity among the citizens of the country. Alongside their multiculturalism, for example, in Uganda, we also recognize kingdoms are recognized, and we also see that at the national level, all citizens still feel at ease by recognizing their nationalism and patriotism as Ugandans. Secondly, I will say that nationalistic identity will promote globalization and state development. When all people believe in one nation, one nationality, this will enable the country to grow quicker than when it is divided under multiculturalism. For example, we shall see that when a certain tribe holds certain of tourism and multiculturalism, this will lead to underdevelopment of some other parts of the country, thus creating underdevelopment. So a crossing opposite way, we welcome culturalism and nationalist identities. I'll first compare the events of the events now, we see that mostly in 1962, where most countries around Africa just gained independence, there was a lot of multiculturalism compared to now, where we realize that there is nationalistic identity. For example, in Uganda, after 1962, we saw that the first president of Uganda was a king of a certain kingdom, Buganda, in Uganda. This was based on multiculturalism, where the Uganda almost wanted to overtake the other tribes in the prime minister who came up was Milton Obote. He came up with other policies that promoted national identity, where all cultures were to be involved. He even had an idea of abolishing all kingdoms. Who abolished this, we saw that many political parties were promoted based not only on culture, but they were based according to the national ideologies. We saw like the UPC, Uganda People's Congress, unlike the Kabaka Eka that was the ruling party, that was based on multiculturalism. So we do not denounce multiculturalism, but we say that alongside multiculturalism, there is national identity. We also have an example of Rwanda. Just after the 1962, when Rwanda got independence, the first rulers were based on multiculturalism, where we saw that they were promoting the Hutu alone and the Tutsi alone. Later developed into a conflict that resulted into the 1994 genocide, where we saw the two tribes fighting one another. Then there came another wave of Congress that promoted national identity, where they all wanted to come out as Rwandans and all fight for their country. We now see that Rwanda is one of the most developing African countries. It's now ranked among the best 10 now that it has multiculturalism alongside national identity. However, against multiculturalism promoted alone without national identity, it would cause problems such as, we see that this result into oppression and miscommunication. This will be a problem. Therefore, our government does this motion, it should very resolve nationalistic identities. For example, we see that it should bring out school educational programs on national identities. We see this. I'll still give an example of Uganda, where the first primary education, like the first 3 years of primary education, are based on multiculturalism. We see that these students who grow up in this government system of education, where they are supposed to come up with their local languages. In Uganda, we have more than 100 local languages. We teach our students in their areas their own local languages, yet we have one national language, that is English. We see the private schools that only teach English bring out the best students. So this system of without national identity, that will first leave English, the national language, and first promote the local languages, we see that these students come out a lot of students. Some pupils will be well organized with, like they are exposed to the outer schools will be teaching local languages. They should first also include the nationalistic identity, which is English, so that they can well be molded up and come out as one strong generation of citizens. I'll first say our opening government came and multiculturalism alone without national identity will promote equality, but multiculturalism without national identity will strictly lead to inequality, because without national identity, that means there will be oppression, there will be nepotism, there will be what, and the country will be in tatters. If not, if we do uphold national identity, then the crossing government came up with a extension of echo chambers, saying that multiculturalism will prevent isolation of some cultural groups. But I say that multiculturalism is nice. It won't. I'm sorry. He said that multiculturalism without national identity will create echo chambers and isolation of some cultural groups. But we see that multiculturalism, in hand with national identity, will instead bring out the oppressed national cultural groups. For example, here in Uganda, we have the Pygmies. We see that in those periods of without national identity, these people were in forests, these people were oppressed, they were ignored by the other tribes of the country. But now the state came up with the idea of nationalistic ideology. We see that they brought out these people to include them in the society of the country, where we now see them participating in national activities, and they have greatly led to the development of the country. So, panel, I would like to say that the government should greatly bring up the issue of multiculturalism, but it should not ignore nationalistic identities, because we see that there are many ways in which. No, I'm not taking. I'll take it in my last.
No, it's time.
Ways in
Sandra,
priorities can be up.
Sandra, it's
For
time.
example,
Sandra, it's time up.
all right, time up. It should come up with patriotic clubs to bring out national identity. We also see the intermarriages that should be upheld
Sandra,
with both patriotism and national identity. Thank you, panel.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Sandra, just to clarify, after 7:15, we don't write anything. So it's to continue, just like for future rounds, just make sure that you just like stop at 7:15 because we don't write anything after that. Anyways, thank you very much for that great speech. I invite the closing government case here.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Starting in 3, panel, you get 4 things in my web speech. Firstly, you get analysis on why we think we have more value for like these nationalistic identities that side closing opposition fights for so much on our side of the world. Second, you get analysis on why we think would rather exist in a space where we value more things like patriotism existing because people opt into these cultures than have things like toxic nationalism because we've systematically demonized other cultures and deemed them in like chose not to acknowledge their existence. But lastly, the punish the state is also a very important stakeholder in this debate. We get analysis on why we think we're in a better position to engage them as a stakeholder. And lastly, we get engagement on why we think about like opening government in this debate. Throughout these questions, I'll be showing you why opening opposition is already started opening opposition or brings in a number of ideas in this debate. Firstly, they bring ideas now things like multiculturalism, like at that point then we undermine like other cultures in the state, and people are less likely to opt into these things simply because they overshadow their own cultures or these things such as like the language barrier that exists in the states. And lastly, we get analysis on why the state as an actor has no incentive to do this because they've constantly failed. We think member of government does a good job in engaging with the analysis on why this individual, on why the state still has that very same obligation even if they're bound to fail. But most importantly, engage what exactly like this on what exactly these policies look like, from things like social that like vulnerable groups can opt into, to things like legislation that allow them to exist in safe spaces and like people have like more value. But most importantly, when we criminalize these things, it means that the state stands up against these things and does not affirm the systematic discrimination. But most importantly, we think when the state chooses to keep quiet and stay silent, we think that is even more affirmation and consent to kind of discrimination that exists against these individuals. And we think it's imperative that the state intervenes that. But secondly, we think when they say that people are less likely to opt into these things, is they're more likely to overshadow their own cultures, right? This is exactly what it looks like instead of fighting for multiculturalism. In a world that systematically glorify these nationalistic cultures and allow them to exist, when they constantly strike down and discriminate against most individuals in minority cultures that are vulnerable, it inherently means that these very same individuals continue to exist in an echo chamber where their own ideology is the most important, and there's no one that can challenge that ideology or account for any social evils they might engage in because of that systematic glorification. But most importantly, that lack of value and affirmation of like the individuals were systematically discriminated against. But then the most relevant team in opposition or that brings in the number of ideas. One, the team that will think that multiculturalism promotes things like social division, more likely to value from the superior culture and develop those spaces exclusively because of that entire aspect of how like because of identify them as like multiculturalism. But we think like what they don't recognize is that already when we look at things like the nationalistic cultures they fight for. We think these cultures already have got more traction in society, but despite like having more traction, we think like they've got the more oppressive, they've got the more oppressive ideology that strike down on vulnerable groups. But most important is to say, because this is smartly purified, it means that even at some point we said like CEO says this thing should exist in the same bracket. It currently means that they continue to exist in the same space where there's a continued like, glorification of this nationalistic culture because of the traction they've managed to gain over the years. But most importantly, those adding value and importance they have. We don't think that like when like these things exist in the same bracket, like the government greatly acknowledges these nationalistic cultures and puts them in the same institutions as individuals was tracked down upon. We don't think that we get any kind of traction for individuals or ministers. That's it. And at that point in time, we don't think that like we allow them to be integral members of society. Secondly, when they say we ought to have like more value for a national identity, is promoting the national unity and people in a better position to ensure that, and people are in a better position to ensure that like they fight as a coalition and then cripple multiple stereotypes. But we don't think that we get sufficient analysis to prove why at the point at which like you force like individuals who are a minority, individuals who don't actively buy into those like nationalistic cultures, when you force them to form a coalition with like these individuals that like systematically strike down upon them and discriminate them. We don't get analysis to prove why like there's this necessary like value, but most importantly, what population stands firm and is in a better position to spark the amount of change economically and social or political aside like CO ones. We think rather the political parties that exist on a cultural basis and a value for like the exclusive needs of individuals in those cultural groups instead of society where these individuals is not respected up and there's no value for them due to that kind of discrimination that exists. But most importantly, the lack of value for the lack of value for the need like of representation for most of these individuals. We think CO is out of this debate. At the point, the most important aspect in this debate is to have more, to have that kind of that value for those nationalistic ideals. At what point does it exist in the most meaningful form? We think it exists in its most meaningful form when individuals opt into those national cultures, but are not coerced to opt into those cultures due to the lack of an alternative. We think at that point in time, like that individuals that buy into these national cultures are individuals that are patriotic. But most importantly, we think on opposition side of the world, it's not nationalism, but it's nationalism that exists on a toxic platform. Because one, it premise on an idea that your culture is the only important thing, but most importantly, it exists in this echo chamber where individuals can even become radical and cannot be accountable because of the excessive glorification they get. Why do we think about open government? OJ gives you a number of things, ideas around how we give people a choice when it comes to an identity and like things like how governments have an incentive towards everyone. Second, we get analysis on like protection of minorities and like how like there's international traction. But to get largely from opposition, like benefits that exist the moment you implement this, but the moment governments implement these policies. But CHA gives you analysis on how those particular benefits come about. When you talk about things like choice, we think choice exists in a more meaningful form when individuals have got more options, when individuals have got more platforms that can act. We think on our side of those more platforms exist because not only gives them the option of the national culture that exists, but it gives them the option of like the diverse institutions that governments like establish and allow the minority groups to opt into. But second, when they say governments have more of an incentive towards everyone, we give you analysis to say we think that incentive exists more on our side of the world when one government undermines the creation of echo chambers by the systematic glorification of majority cultures and like systematic the humanization of minority cultures. We think at that point in time, government inherently fulfills its obligation towards everyone. But lastly, when they say government protects minorities, we give you analysis on what these policies actively look like, something we don't get from opening government. We talk about things like legislation, but most importantly, different social institutions they can opt into. We think the idea of international traction in investments is even more analyzed on the side of the world and given to say the reason why in the first place they don't get that international traction is because they're dependent on these oppressive bodies that know not be in an answer. To give examples of things, countries like Korea. We think on the side of the world to get more engagement with most of these states when they give that more positive outlook. We take the debate. We're so proud to propose.
Thank you very much, Cameron, for that great speech. I invite the OPWIP to conclude the debate here. OPWIP.
All right. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. Just to confirm, that's the second speaker we are all impersonating.
Yeah, I'm the second speaker, but I'm using the same devices my member of government opposition.
Okay, just to confirm, who was speaking first? Was it Sandra or?
Hopkins.
Okay, easy. Thank you.
No, I am speaking second. Hopkins. Then Sandra was speaking.
Okay, easy. Thank you.
Okay. I'm starting in 3. 1, 2, 3. Panel. We're here to debate about whether the nationalistic identities, whether multiculturalism should be affronted by the government and made for policies at the expense of the nationalist identities. We are not here to debate whether we should do away with multiculturalism. That is why the member of government comes in and tells us that that we should promote culture. It's a good thing. Multiculturalism in existence. It is not like in any way not in existence. It is there, but why do we need to? Why does the government want to prioritize it at the expense of nationalistic identities? This is what they do not bring on table. The first speaker of the government comes and tells us that multiculturalism promotes peace, it promotes equality, it promotes the people don't forget their culture, but all this is in existence. Looking at a state like Uganda, we have different kingdoms in Uganda. We have Baganda, we have all these, and they are written in the constitution and they are in existence. Everybody knows what is their culture. Why we think that it should not be promoted at the expense of the nationalistic idea identity is because that the nation is a state and it should be treated as a state. The nation has very many cultures. It has more than 10 cultures, and you cannot affront multiculturalism against the nation's identity, because it will cripple down globalization. And this government has not. Why we think that multiculturalism cannot be affronted in the beginning and it failed, and that's why the nationalistic identity comes into affront. Well, the deputy prime minister comes in and says that why, and asks us a question that why is multiculturalism not positive? It is actually there. What we want is what this debate wanted to find out was whether it should be done at the expense of nationalistic identities. So why the closing opposition takes first in this debate is because we were able to identify the reason why identities are more important than multiculturalism, because it categorizes people. National identity categorizes people at individual level. It promotes human rights at individual level. That is why we have rights of speech, rights of movement. We can do trade and business at individual level, not at cultural level. If we were to go at culture level, that would cripple development, because you now need to first identify your culture so that you can really cripples the development. It causes nepotism, as the member of opposition government said. So now, why the government does not stand to win in this debate? Because they fail to nationalistic identities should be crippled. It's why they think multiculturalism should stand out at the expense of nationalistic identity. That the nationalistic can promote globalization when another national promotion of tourism, that is promotion of education, because each person has their own language, but by studying one language in a nation, a formal language in a nation, as a nationalistic identity, it promotes language association, social interactions. That's why the government side does a chance to win this debate. Now, the opening opposition came and told us that there is area and multiculturalism obstructs and undermines people's culture, and this is true. Decided to promote. There is what we call antagonistic cultures, cultures that undermine people's rights, cultures that are against human rights. That's why nationalistic identities should be upfronted and should not be put at any on the expenses of shouldn't or underestimated. Why? Because they are cultures that promote gender discrimination, like female genital mutilation, cultures that undermine people. My member of government said PGMs, those cultures need to be tamed, and those cultures can only be tamed by the nationalistic identity, by the nation. When the nation it believes that people should make their choices, people should not be forced to do things because of where they come from, then this promotes peace. Actually, it promotes equality, it promotes happiness. When you say that multiculturalism is not affronted, then I'm going to ask you why there were wars affronted. Remember, in the years back, 1962, we have had the 1994 sides, had the cultural rebellions, cultural wars. Why have they been there? Now that we are upfronting nationalistic identity, that's why this debate is actually on the side of the opposition, because we know the value of why we need the nation to be together, for a state to interact with another state as a nation, not as not in a multicultural identity. Because cultures have different beliefs. Cultures have beliefs that disagree with other cultures. This will be a very hard thing to be able to connect cultures of our country to cultures of another country, of a country itself. If we cannot connect, like for example, Uganda together, how can we connect cultures with cultures in China? This is so impossible, because how will we even communicate with people in China if we don't embrace a nationalistic identity with national language and with national symbols? And how will we speak our vernacular with those? That's why I feel that multiculturalism will cripple modernization, globalization, all ways of development. So the CG, the closing government, doesn't bring any case in this debate. They simply say that that the government establishes policies that criminalize culture, but that is not true. Government establishes policies that promote individual human rights, and if we are able to promote individual promote and prevail our culture, because if the human rights promote in the constitution, if we have rights of culture, that means that we're promoting culture. There is no point criminalizing culture. Then they say that policies of the national identity overshadow culture. This is impossible. How can you overshadow culture when you are trying to promote globalization?
Sorry, I had to mute you because of time. I'll unmute you again. Okay, great. Can I have teams to confirm their presence? Opening government is confirmed. Opening opposition, are you here? Zuzela, can you hear us? If you are here.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. Closing government, are you is here? Closing opposition, can you hear me? Closing opposition,
Yes,
son. Okay, great. Everyone can mute. Yeah, so just general feedback first and then like the results. I think like this was like a little bit below average too. at least being averaged to some point. I think like there's like a huge misunderstanding of what like the debate seeks to achieve from pretty much all the teams in this debate. It's unclear from pretty much every speaker what your end goal is, because I can get the idea like, oh sure, there's like a huge difference between multiculturalism and nationalistic ideas, but what's your end goal at that point? Firstly, it's a should motion. Sure, it's like this house believes that states should do something. It means then there should be an enactment of a policy. So I think from in the opening half debate, we still need to hear something about like how the policy is going to look like. For example, are you going to, because like it's more of like a political thing, are you going to like, how are you going to promote like those kind of multiculturalism, multiculturalistic policies at that point? So is this something that you are going to have like maybe have like different states having like their own like local kingdoms? Are you going to say if like you have like a certain tribe that believes like in having like kings, are they going to have like that idea of them being like self-governing and like having their own kings at that point? This is something that is very, very important when it comes to like pretty much clarifying how your policy looks like and like how we should then understand the policy as a whole. That's the first idea that I think is very, very important. The motion is yes, a should in it. It means there should be at least an understanding of like how the policy is going to work at that point. Secondly, there's a huge logical gap pretty much from all the speakers. What this means is people claim a lot of ideas, but it's like there's no clear analysis to why that claim that you have provided is true, or why there's a link between your claim and your analysis, or your claim and the kind of examples that you're giving within the debate. Like those kind of logical gaps are very, very important. There are 5 ways on how you can mitigate those kind of gaps. Firstly, provide a claim and provide an analysis, provide an example to the claim, and provide a link by explaining why your claim is true. And then at last, maybe you can say, even if that claim is not true, why is it still important for us to win the debate anyways? Something like that. The fourth thing is like, it's unclear from all the teams as well on like where exactly do we draw the line. Most teams here are just like saying, oh, no, let's do multiculturalism. Some teams are saying, oh, no, let's do nationalistic ideas. It's unclear of like where we draw the line really. Are you in support of multiculturalism? Are you in support of nationalistic ideas? Are they going to be like extremely two different policies to say, once we have multiculturalism, we don't have like nationalistic ideas? It's unclear from all the teams, because most teams just like say, nationalistic ideas are very bad, they harm people, so we need multiculturalism. Some say, no, nationalistic are so good, multiculturalism is so bad, so we need like nationalistic ideas. That kind of distinction is very, very important to say. This is where we draw the line between two claims, right? So with this in mind then, the results were very, very close, but very clear on who wins, but still close. With this in mind, I gave first to closing opposition, second to opening government, third to closing government, and unfortunately a fourth to opening government, to opening opposition, sorry. So the results are CO, OG, CG, O. Why then did I come up with like those results? I'll go from opening government through down to closing opposition at that point. From opening government, I think like the case is clear on like what they're trying to defend. You get a clear definition as well of like what multiculturalism is and what it entails to achieve. Firstly, they talk about like how one, it seeks to create a space for coexistence. Sure, they say it seeks to create a space that allows policies to identify minority groups. The kind of example that you give here is like the Kurdistans, to say these individuals, as indigenous people, they've like usually isolated. And that kind of isolation has like made them to continuously like get some forms of disenfranchisement, not only within like their local identities, but also from like the nationalistic level at that point. Why then are they promoting this policy? They give you a couple of ideas here. First, they say they want to narrow inequality. This is what they talk about, the idea to say, sure, people speak like people are not allowed to speak like their own local languages at some point, because like there's like a huge forms of like inequality. We don't solve that form of inequality, but what we do is like we suppress that forms when we allow people to have that kind of the kind of expression when they have their own personal or like their own cultures being embraced, right? I think like what could have helped them to rank higher that argument then, because I think this way closing opposition like took a chance to say, oh no, we can solve these things regardless, right? I think like what you guys could have done then is to try and explain the differences, to say how are these people not allowed to speak like their own languages? Even like people can have different cultures and still be able to speak like their own languages at like their own local sites, but like those languages may not be recognized at national level. For example, like countries may just like, let's say, like you can have 150 languages, but they can only recognize like 3 languages as national languages, something like that. And why that is, that may be fair to minorities, something like that. The second thing that you guys argue was on promoting peace. That argument was not sufficient for you guys to win the debate, because it's still unclear to me how are you going to promote peace? Your argument that you try to give as a form of example is like, oh, countries like Afghanistan are always at war. It's unclear what causes war in Afghanistan. Like, is that war caused by the ideas of nationalism, or it's just like war that is caused by people with like different beliefs, right? I think because there's some logical gap within like that kind of idea. It's unclear for me how I could rank you higher with that kind of argument. Sure, I think the argument is, I get a sense of where you're trying to go, but I still think then there should be some forms of like logic with your argument of like how you're more likely to promote peace at that point. And you say you're going to protect minority groups, which is sure you're going to protect them, but I still think like there should be some forms of like extensive analysis of like how you're more likely to do that. The other thing that I do appreciate from opening government was like when they try to go a step further to show, why do we do this at the expense of something? This is what they talk about, to say, one, oftentimes minority groups don't have an incentive to follow government policies. For example, people may be anti-vaxxers just because that they are viewed as minorities. When you integrate them and allow them to have like some form of understanding, that it means you give them a huge incentive then to follow the government policies that are more likely to exist. And they talk about like why those minorities are usually important, particularly when it comes to the growth of the economy, which again was in direct contention to what closing government, to what closing opposition was trying to prove in the debate. How does opening opposition then enter the debate? Opening opposition gives you a couple of ideas. They say you need to have a connection to ancestors through nationalistic ideologies, which might be true. I think like some countries may have like that idea to say that nationalism may have like a connection to ancestors, but I still think like it's unclear on like how people with their own multicultural individual ideologies, like for example, like if I use the example that opening up in Gap, the Kurds, right? The Kurds themselves may have like that form of connection with their ancestors through their own culture and their own religion as a minority group within Iran and like those Middle Eastern countries that have the Kurds within them. I think then at best what I needed was a form of maybe a comparative analysis to prove why you can't do the same when you prioritize your own individual culture or your own ethnicity at that point. Two, they term that multiculturalism is like language barriers because people are going to speak their own culture. I think like this is like a direct contention to opening government, because opening government says we need people to have an ability to embrace their own culture, to embrace their own language. Opening opposition says when you embrace your own language, it means you're going to have a barrier in communication. So I think it may be true to some degree from opening opposition that we need to embrace you need to have like an embracement of like a national language where people can have like some forms of common understanding at that point. But I think like that even if I try to swing to opening opposition on that claim, I think because like that argument itself was not fully like developed, I couldn't like reward them that much. The last thing that we get from opening opposition was like on how we are going to undermine the identity that the national individuals do identify with at that point, which is true to a certain degree. But now I'm weighing between the two claims, because what opening government claims is like you already undermine the culture and the identity of the minorities in that instance. These people have continuously been disenfranchised, they have been excluded from government policies, they don't necessarily like have a sense of belonging with like those countries. prettiest example that I do give is the cards. I think like the cards makes it easier for you to understand like how these indigenous people have been isolated completely. At a point at which the Kurdistan don't even have like a form of national identity themselves, it means they don't necessarily like have an identity that they can identify with, even if you want to promote. At a point then that we want to have everyone having some form of identity, it is very important to embrace that kind of multiculturalism at that point. At that point, then, it is clear for me in the opening half that opening government wins the clashes. When you go to closing government enters the debate in a very nice way. I think they try to give a principle where they talk about the ideas of feasibility, to say, regardless of feasibility, there's a principle that the government has to intervene when it comes to protecting the minorities. If the culture that is pervasive and creates some forms of echo chambers is very harmful, the government then is got a mandate to intervene and promote like those cultures of the minorities at that point. I think that kind of response as a principle already eliminates opening opposition in the debate. I can't run above opening government, however, for a couple of reasons. The extension that you do get from closing government are quite simple. Firstly, the idea of choice. I think that choice is unclear from closing government on what they're trying to defend. They like choice on two levels. The first layer of choice, like once you embrace multiculturalism, it means you are going to give people an option to choose which culture that they want to embrace. At that point, it's unclear to me whether culture is a form of choice or culture is something that is embedded within you. For example, do you choose to identify, like, let's say, if you are an African, and then you go to Europe, and then they try to you have some form of multiculturalism, and then Africanism is one of the cultures. Do you choose to opt out of Africanism and maybe become like an opt into another culture, maybe like let's say like the Red Indian culture, for example? It's unclear to me why that choice is something that is important, given that people don't opt out of culture. Culture is something that is embedded within you, something that is within you. I think the best kind of analysis that could have happened in that kind of argument was that when you have multiculturalism, it means you create some forms of awareness, because what multiculturalism does is it creates a sense of understanding of different cultures. It means there's like a huge social cohesion where people can understand the different cultures. Then you minimize some forms of like discrimination at that point. This looks like where try to take a simple example, really. Like, let me just like say the cards. I think because this is like the exam that came from OD, where the cards are discriminated, disenfranchised. If you promote multiculturalism, it means you create a sense where everyone now has an understanding of like the cards' background, where they come from, how they developed, and why they've been harmful or discriminated for a long time, and why they need that kind of protection in that instance. I think that kind of argument could have been better rather than choice, because choice in and of itself is not something that I do believe in, given that people don't opt in and opt out of culture. The kind of level of choice that we get from closing government was like, oh, once you make this like a criminal thing, like people can then choose whether they discriminate, they go to jail. I think that kind of argument, that argument was not convincing enough on why should we then like promote that kind of culture, like the kind of the multiculturalism, if the only choice that is there is like people may not choose to abide to what the other culture has, or they can just choose to go to jail just because they don't believe in what other people do believe in at that point. So that kind of choice as an extension was not sufficient for me to bring them above opening government. Second thing in terms of extension that you get from closing government was the value of nationalistic identity. Under this, they give you two layers. First, they talk about like why like nationalistic ideas become like more valuable because you embrace other cultures, which is true. I do believe, I think this argument didn't come from opening up, and I do reward them as well when they talk about that idea to say when you embrace other cultures, then nationalistic ideas become like more valuable at that point. But then I can't reward them above opening government when it comes to that kind of argument for a couple of reasons. Firstly, I think opening government already talks about the ideas of like why within like the nationalistic ideas themselves, like you still have some form of like marginalization, all those kind of things, and like you want to create some forms of like reduction of inequality and all those kind of things. If you take if you use like the same language of understanding, then it means at a point at which you're able to reduce that kind of marginalization and that kind of inequality, then it means you become like so valuable in terms of like your own nationalistic ideas, because one, you promote other cultures as well. So I think like then for that argument to weigh more about opening government, some form of like extensive analysis was needed. The second thing under that was that you allow people to opt into other cultures, places in what was like not necessarily like usually important. That thing that we get was like when cultures don't get embraced, they become like more radical. They give an example of Boko Haram. That argument itself could have been the winning argument if it was further explained, because it's unclear whether that is true, right? So Boko Haram is so extreme and they're so radical in Nigeria, but Boko Haram acts in the same way as ISIS. ISIS is in Iran. Iran is like an Islamic state. ISIS are Islam, Boko Haram are Islam, and they act in the same way. So how then is it true that once we embrace like the Boko Haram in Nigeria, we're going to change the perception or the way in which they view things? It's unclear why that is true. So I think like then what was important was for you to prove to a certain degree why the embracement of like the kind of differences that exist within the Boko Haram is something that is going to change the way they behave, or to explain a bit that the way in which Boko Haram is behaving is due to the perception in which the Nigerian society has towards them, something like that. So it's just like there was just like a claim to say, oh, the Boko Haram is acting this way, so once we do this, we're going to change the way they act at that point. So I still don't understand why that is true to a certain degree. So I can't really reward that. The other argument that was important from the government, which I think like it made them like have also to easily link up opening opposition, was like the idea of like how when you don't embrace other cultures at like their own cultural level, like you fail to recognize them at regional level or at national level. This is where they talk about like the existence of like xenophobic attacks, particularly in African states. To say the reason why there's a huge existence of xenophobic attack in African states is due to the ideas of like the differences in ideologies. This argument came from opening government. Opening government talks about the idea of promoting peace. So the argument from opening government, it was still unclear as well, that's as closing government. The idea from opening government was like people in Afghanistan have that those same attacks where they are fighting continuously, and the reason why they are fighting is because of like the differences in like ideas and differences in cultures. Even if that is not true, the same logic is what closing government runs when they say if you don't embrace the cultures of these people, if you're still going to have like the same like attacks where people do have like some forms of conflict at that point. With that reason, closing government couldn't rank above opening government in this debate. Why then does closing opposition rank above everyone else? I think closing opposition becomes very simple because they end the debate in a simple way. I think the first thing that they do have is the clarity to say this debate does not seek to trade off one over the other. This debate can exist on both ways, where you can promote multiculturalism and you can promote nationalistic ideas, which is true. They don't stop there. They say you need to question, because this is where you draw the line, right? This is what I was saying through my personal feedback. You need to understand where you draw the line between the two, because you can have them both in existence, but this debate says at the expense of, meaning that even if both teams agree that we can have a push of both multiculturalism and nationalistic ideas, but we need them to prioritize one over the other when these two clashes. So how do they clash? The clash exists when there is a conflict of interest between cultures, i.e., if like let's say we have like I think because all of us here are African, so it's easy to relate. So if like we have like a culture that believes mostly in African tradition religion, that is something that is so stoned within them, versus like a culture that doesn't believe in African tradition religion, but only believes in let's say Christianity, for example. Now those two cultures are usually conflicting. This is where we draw the line. Which one should you prioritize? Obviously, most states prioritize Christianity over the African tradition religion. Gov team then defend the idea to say we should then take all the kind of nationalistic idea and prioritize the idea of like individual cultures. Closing opposition clarifies this actually from the whip speech, it becomes very clear. They're saying some cultures are very antagonistic in nature. What they do is they are oftentimes against other cultures and they're against human rights. That is to say, there is an existence of cultural war and cultural conflict that exists. The example that I do give here is like when post-independence, most African states were embracing some forms of multiculturalism, i.e. Rwanda, where people like the Tutsis and the Hutus like had like their own forms of like identity, where like people could like embrace their own like local kingdoms and all those kind of things. But there was like a huge push of genocide because of like, the conflict that existed between like those cultures. Whether that is true or not, we don't know. But the main idea of the argument itself is that when you have multiculturalism and a culture is antagonistic, you are still going to have some forms of conflict. But when you push for both multiculturalism and nationalism, but prioritize nationalism, it means when you reach the point where you now have to question on which one you prioritize, you value nationalistic ideas because nationalistic ideas oftentimes will put a stop that kind of antagonism that exists within cultures, right? The second thing they do say is like then at that point where you put a stop to that kind of antagonism, it means you promote the rights of individuals at an individual level. That is to say, sure, we don't give you an excess liberty as like a small minority ethnic group if your ethnicity or if your own belief is going to be like extremely harmful to other people at national level. That is something that I do believe from closing opposition. The second thing that closing opposition then says was the idea of like why there's a huge promotion of language integration. This directly engages to opening government because opening government says, people are not allowed to speak like their own languages, something like that, and all those kind of things. Closing opposition says we can have people speaking their own languages, but we need to have a form of national identity where people can have a language that they can identify with to say, this is our national language, this is our national identity. If we are Ugandans, this is like how we identify ourselves as. So if you want people to speak their own languages, sure, they can do that when we promote things like multiculturalism, but we can't then say just because we want multiculturalism, we should do it at the expense of our own nationalistic ideas, because that kind of nationalistic idea, particularly in the form of language, helps us to have like a lot of ideas, for example, like how you push within like globalization and all that kind of things. So based on that kind of clarity that you get from closing opposition, it was very easy for me then to reward closing opposition above every other team, because it's very clear from closing opposition on where you draw the line between the two. Other teams were just like comparing one over the other, whether or not like this one is going to be good or it's going to be bad, or whether or not we're going to like have some form of marginal benefits or you prioritize one over the other, which is true to a certain degree. But it's a debate and it's like more of like an expense over the other, which means they can both exist. But when you meet a point where you say this is a point of conflict, which one do you prioritize more over the other at that point? So yeah, with this in mind, first closing opposition, second opening government, third closing of government, and unfortunately a fourth to opening opposition. This marks the end of my feedback. Personal feedback, oh my God, I don't have time for now, but you can send me a text and then later on or tomorrow when I have time, I'll try to give personal feedback. But yeah, you can send me a text, whether on Discord or on WhatsApp, feel free. Anyways, all the best in the next round. Bye. Oh, if I leave, any questions?